Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We have a very special guest today. I'm really delighted to be sitting here today with my colleague, Vanessa Reiser, who is also the author of a very special book and an expert that I think we're all going to enjoy listening to. I'm going to start with a um, kind of brief introduction, but I want you to know as much as you can about her before we get into our conversation today. So bear with me because this is so incredibly important and well deserved. And I'm just so happy that she's sitting here with me. Vanessa Reiser is a trauma and dialectical behavioral therapy trained psychotherapist. She's licensed in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Florida, specializing in narcissistic abuse and cult abuse. She is the author of an incredible book called Narcissistic Abuse, A Therapist's Guide to Identifying, Escaping, and Healing from Toxic and Manipulative People. The teletherapist team specializes in narcissistic abuse, cult abuse, coercive control, domestic violence, eating disorders, anxiety, depression, and all things trauma related, as well as a host of other issues. I'm going to let Vanessa tell us all about where we can learn more about her work and the projects that she is involved in. Also, shout out and congratulations to Vanessa on her new podcast program. She is trained in dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, cognitive processing therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy. She is also certified in teletherapy. Vanessa, welcome. I couldn't
Thank
be
you
more
for having
delighted.
me.
Oh, well, I'm really
Always a
excited.
pleasure.
I'm really excited. I have some incredibly thoughtful questions that were submitted by my online community members, along with some of my own, and would just also love to hear anything else you might like to share along the way. So I've really been looking forward to being in this conversation with you.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, your work often highlights, and one of the things I loved in your book, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, is the way you talk about it's some of the language, some of the language that really makes the reality of what happens to individuals in relationships where there is narcissistic abuse so real, makes it so vivid, so clear, so compelling. And one of the things you say, it's something that's always stuck with me, is this idea of the dissolving of the self. How one can kind of almost literally lose that sense of self and identity. Your work highlights the hidden dynamics of narcissistic abuse. What do you think this is a question that a lot of the community wanted to understand. What do you think people most consistently misunderstand about these relationships?
That the narcissist is, always a jerk or is always unkind or is always devaluing. Narcissists are particularly charming
Mm.
in, a lot of ways and are very beloved in communities, in your neighborhoods, in your churches, in your synagogues, and so they are oftentimes very difficult to get away from because there is such wonderful experiences to be had with them. So I think this idea that somebody is a narcissist is just kind of like always mean or always a jerk is a misnomer. They are oftentimes very, very loving and will adore you and your family and do all of these kind of over the top wonderful things
Mm.
that are very carefully thought out. And so I think that's really important for people to understand sort of the Jekyll and Hyde of it all. There's kind of this double-sided experience.
And the carefully thought out is very interesting terminology because what you're describing and what I have found too in working with the narcissistic individuals themselves is that a lot of this can be the heroics, right? This is the performance. This is the look at me, I'm the good guy, I'm the great guy, I'm the really, really special one. And not that it's never authentic, not that it's never coming from a genuine place, but so often it's coming from this place of performance, isn't it? Which leaves partners and family members often feeling like, well, I don't know, so wonderful out there to the world, and sometimes even wonderful in here. So what does that mean about me?
And
right?
sometimes they can actually create the problem that they subsequently repair. So we
Mm.
see this oftentimes, like they might cancel a flight you have and then rebook it to be the hero. So they can actually create the problem, repair the problem so that they can be the hero. And some of that is really forward thinking and can be kind of maniacal in terms of like that forethought. Like this is something that they're really plotting to do and kind of preparing to do along the way. It's a very it seems like something that would be very exhausting to most of us. But to situate themselves as the hero is something that they create the problem oftentimes to do.
To rescue,
Yeah,
right?
that's
To
right.
be the rescuer. Yeah. In your book, Narcissistic Abuse, you talk about patterns that keep people stuck. What are some of the most subtle ones that even intelligent, self-aware people tend to miss? Because so often I find working with clients who will say, how did I miss this? Right? As if it should always be so overt, and it isn't always so overt.
hmm I think things that keep people stuck would be that cycle of idolize, devalue, and then kind of the fight, right? So it's like this makeup session, tension building, fallout, makeup session, tension building, fallout. And this sort of happens on repeat. And then we begin to develop this real desire to feel that makeup session again. And it's been likened to a drug addiction. So this is a cycle of abuse.
Mhm.
There are some other things that can be peppered throughout, but just to simplify, those three things occur on repeat. And then you have something develop that's called a trauma bond. And I think a lot of people get this term really messed up. They think people are bonding around shared trauma, but in fact, that trauma bond develops kind of purposefully through these reinforcers. And so then you're kind of like, okay, give me that drug kick again, make it okay. Even sometimes just the removal of the love bombing can be the devalue, because then you're sitting there going, what did I do wrong? Why aren't you being nice to me anymore? So there doesn't have to be an overt devalue. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical violence
Okay.
or somebody calling you names. It can just be the removal of the love bomb. And
Mhm.
those kind of reinforcers will get us really caught up. And it's extremely hard to extricate yourself from this if you don't have the understanding of what it looks like, what these patterns are, what measurables, what structure. Otherwise, you're just, thinking maybe, this person is just having a bad day, or maybe I can fix this, maybe I can work on this. But those patterns seem to be part of the playbook, and it's really important for people to understand those terms, I think.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful that you just brought in the terminology of the trauma bond because that is a highly misunderstood and more complicated experience, I think, than most people realize. And you just really gave a very good description of that. It reminded me of, I know you have this in your work history as I do, of working in domestic violence and seeing that cycle of violence that started once upon a time. I mean, back in the 90s, 80s, when I was doing the work, it was so clear then, how, to use the term you used, addicting it can be to wait for that movement into the honeymoon phase, where everything is loving and charming. I'm so sorry, and it's not going to happen again. And it feels so real until it doesn't anymore, until it goes away. And you're working really hard to figure out, how do I get it back? And what do I need to do to make that happen? Right?
Yeah. And I think, as like the breadcrumb of it all too, is so many people will come to me and say, like, I don't know, I don't really get this love bombing. But understand that the love bombing in this repeated cycle can just be the removal of the silent treatment, even just that little text of like, hey, how are you? It's like, oh, he's finally talking to me again, this kind of thing, this sort of subtle thing would be technically, we would probably bring that into the idealization phase just because he's unleashed you from the silent treatment. So you're free. It's like, oh, thank God, I'm not, in the punishment of it all, this kind of thing. So, love bombing, I think, is another word that we sort of throw around. But there are a lot of things that are attached to that to give you a fuller understanding, of what it might look like.
Hmm. Absolutely. And the other term that's quite popular and perhaps overused at times is this is gaslighting. And you speak about the psychological toll of gaslighting, reality distortion, right? How does it reshape a person's sense of reality over time? How does it affect one's sense of confidence in their own thinking, in their own knowledge base of what's happening, what has happened, what's about to happen?
I think this one is very interesting because it comes in so many different shapes and sizes. It's not necessarily that age-old version of gaslighting, which is like, the person tells you, I didn't say that, or something like that, and you become confused, which is gaslighting. But I think I consider it a brain injury. When I went through this experience, I began to stutter. I was sort of decompensating based on that reality loss. And it can also look like somebody hiding your belongings or cyber gaslighting you. Somebody who hacks into your Apple ID and starts messaging people, and you're wondering, did I do that? This kind of thing. So there also is the word salad, where you're sort of talking about things in circular conversations and you're beginning to question because it's just this on repeat. Um, and so there's different versions of it that I think are really important. But anytime something occurred and you begin to question it, it should, you perk up your interest. Your antennas should go up. Is this feels like it's in that realm of gaslighting, and it can be through deflection. If you find yourself confused in a conversation because someone's taking you down another road, and now I'm lost. I've lost this. This can be purposeful to sort of get you confused. So when I start to feel confused around things, I'm very sensitive now, this kind of stuff. But it does come in different shapes and sizes.
Wow, that's just sort of ignited like four questions at once in my brain. So I'm just going to try to see if I can remember them all, figure it out. But it certainly made me think about the spectrum, right, of narcissism. And there's a spectrum in narcissism that also can apply to a spectrum of gaslighting. You just described everything from a more subtle form to a rather severe or malignant form of gaslighting, which, and I remember you using this expression, you can come from, you can come right out of cult abuse, which would be rather severe. And you use the expression coming from a cult of one, which I thought was interesting. Can you say more about these kind of levels of severity and maybe a little bit about your own experience with that?
Yeah, I would, I'm at that point now where I'm so passionate about destigmatizing the word cult because when I spoke to Mark Vicente and I realized he was in the Nexium cult, um, which happened in 2021 or ended in 2021 in New York, didn't happen in a faraway land.
Right.
I realized I was in a cult of one because the same playbook was being used, the same characteristics were in place, and every cult is led by a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath because they're doing the same things. They're going to manipulate a certain amount of people. So you can be in a cult of one, a cult of two, a cult of five, a cult of 5 million. There are a lot of cultic family systems, and the behaviors in the playbook are really the same. And so I'm very, very passionate about, not victim blaming. And so I think it's important for us to understand what cults are, and they really do follow the same exact thing. They're going to use mind control, coercive control, and the same tactics to kind of get you to fall in line so they can get you to do their bidding, etc. But yeah, I was in a relationship with somebody who was narcissistic. And when I got out of it and realized I was in a cult, I was like, wait a minute, me? I was in a cult, not Vanessa. I'm too smart. I'm too badass. There's no way you could. Yes, yes, I was. And so I think it's important for people to understand that this can happen to anyone. If you don't know these characteristics, then you are not immune and you are vulnerable.
Yes. Yeah. And yeah, for sure. And it certainly speaks to, again, that level of severity where we can see the narcissism that is embedded in psychopathy, right? Psychopathic behaviors and narcissism that can be at the other end of the spectrum, just an annoying show off, right? Still annoying, maybe still disruptive in a relationship, but not quite the same. So, yeah, levels of severity. Um, for therapists who may be listening to this, what are some of the biggest mistakes you think that clinicians make when working with partner survivors of narcissistic abuse?
I hate this thing where they say, like, we have to figure out how, what did you, what from your childhood or what did you do that put you in this place? How did you get here? Like, what part of this is your responsibility to unpack and all of this? Now, there are certain things that we go through in life that might groom us or, put us into more vulnerable positions. Maybe we grew up in a religious environment where we are groomed for servitude and we are, being told, to be forgiving and, be mindful of others and be thoughtful, caring. And while these characteristics are tremendous and wonderful, they are also something that can be easily exploited by toxic people. So it's really not, I never victim blame, so I don't like to do that. I'm all about empowering, certainly in some of these more psychodynamic um, modalities, or if you're really wanting to, peel back the onion layers, I think that's fine to do. But I don't know that I would do it at the same time. I feel like, understanding that toxic people are around you and that it's not your fault feels paramount in these scenarios. And then once you kind of gather that healing and do a good amount of the work, you might could lean into, okay, how did I even, find myself? Why wasn't I boundaried? Who kind of missed it there? And how could I have learned this better and that kind of stuff? Um, but I think therapists do make the mistake of kind of getting into some victim blamey language, which does nothing because not people who are being victimized by narcissists are riddled with shame.
Mm.
They can't believe the embarrassment that they did that. So to sort of tisk, tisk, tisk them even slightly feels treacherous because their emotional bandwidth is so shallow. And oftentimes they're still in these environments. And so it's not going to add value to kind of extricate them to sort of make them feel like it's their fault in any way. So I think therapists need to really understand the empowerment piece, how they can kind of get, their clients to step into their power,
Mm.
and to really develop that self-esteem. A lot of times they've been devalued, even if it's through microaggressions. So their inner dialogue, particularly if they have a narcissistic parent, is like really formidable and kind of they need to like do a lot of relearning how to talk to themselves and stuff like this. So I think therapists make a ton of mistakes. Um, and I don't know that they're necessarily ill-intentioned, but I think that they don't really necessarily get it. I know because my clients will come to me and be like, I need to find somebody who gets it. My last therapist just didn't get it. They didn't get it, this kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
I think, therapists can get learned. There's a ton of resources now
Mhm.
to learn how to engage with people that have gone through this.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, yeah, I agree with what you said. And I think you and I might agree on this too, that another one of the unfortunate um, outcomes of being with a therapist who doesn't get it is that you have clients who come out feeling the need to be angry for the rest of their lives in order to feel entitled to the decisions they've made, to feel that there is a kind of self-righteousness in my choice to leave or in my choice to stand up and have a voice. And I feel, and I think you feel, you're entitled to have a voice. You don't have to be angry all the time. Anger is important, and sure, anger, yeah, we all can feel angry about mistreatment and injustice, unfairness, but you're allowed to have a voice that doesn't have to be coming from a body that is constantly consumed by so much anger in order to feel like you're worthy, or in order to feel like you are entitled to take a stand for yourself, to be there,
Yeah.
to ask for to be treated fairly and safely and lovingly.
Yeah, right. You really are entitled to be safe and at peace.
Mhm.
I think, it's good to experience anger. And then in DBT, we kind of like get away from anger. It's like get it out of your system, whether you're journaling or kickboxing or talking to a therapist, and then getting into sort of the opposite action of it and like leaning into love, which might be simple as, smiling at a stranger and kind of getting back into that. And I think a lot of times people develop CPTSD, which can have with it like this high level of irritability. And then they carry shame around that because they are enraged.
Mm.
And sometimes that can be, somewhat in perpetuity. So that's really hard for them to kind of, they would have to lean into that DBT skill of opposite action, I think, quite a bit. Um, but yeah, I'm a big fan of get it off your chest, kind of rage about it in ways that doesn't harm anyone else, and then lean into love. I mean, the best thing I do, like if I'm feeling particularly triggered, is snuggle my dog. My son is a great hugger, things like this.
Yeah.
Gardening, getting grounded,
Mm.
being, out in nature, stuff like that, listening to good jazz music, good smells, stuff like that can be very self-soothing. But I think, yeah, anger is important, but you definitely don't want to stay there.
Right. Yeah. And I do think what you said about, childhood origins, it matters, but it's timing. And I think your point is well taken. It's all in the timing. I want partners to understand what they're dealing with, really understand what they're up against, because that's the first step to that separation between the narcissist and me, right? This is about you and this is me. How did I end up there becomes a question. Well, let's take a look. As you said, you may have been somewhat primed. Just because you grew up with a narcissistic parent or a parent who was dismissive or depriving or subjugating. And so you learned how to silence your voice, doubt yourself, surrender, be submissive. It may have all come as part of, your own coping style, the learning package, which makes it, and these are, really smart, bright, successful people. I always say nobody's immune to getting captured by the charm and the wit and the amazing strategies, if you will, because they are strategies at the end of the day of the narcissist in a courtship phase. No one's immune to that. It's a question of what happens when you're in the thick of it and how much of that stuff that was learned a long time ago as part of survival becomes part of a survival mode now, which is, I think, where people can get stuck, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point is the stuck of it because for me, I was only there a year and 8 months.
Mm,
And I noticed that other women that he was with, my ex, stayed far longer. And so, as much shame as I carried for being in a cult, I think it was my crazy Irish Catholic ragamuffin upbringing, like kind of having this, like who I thought to be somebody who was really independent thinking. I think it was something that saved me
mm,
from that long, drawn out experience. I think it was something where I was questioning all the time. I wasn't going to just, oh, he just meant this. And I did do that. I did do that to an extent. But I think there was a piss and vinegar in me that I end up loving about myself because I see so many people sacrificing decades of their lives to somebody who, is a waste of time.
mm.
So I think to some extent you have to listen to those whispers too. What is your intuition telling you? I mean, you really have to pay attention to those little voices as well, because hopefully somewhere along your life, somebody gave you kind of a tidbit of that badassery that says like, I got to get out of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, how do you help clients differentiate between hope and denial when they're trying to decide? This is a big issue for those individuals who are trying to decide, do I stay? Do I go? What do I do? We know the options are finite, right? You kind of stay put, things continue as they are. You work towards change, maybe with the hope that there can be transformation. And in some cases, there can be. But again, we know that's really small, unfortunately. Or you get out, right? You begin a departure plan. Maybe it's slow, maybe it's fast. How do you help your clients to differentiate between what might be hope and what might be denial of the realities when they're trying to decide whether to stay or go?
Yeah, I think for them, and I put this, I think it's the first sentence in my book because I find it so important. And
Mm,
this is not just for me, but I see the struggles that so many of my clients endure around this concept, which is that the idea that somebody's brain works differently than yours feels like something that's hard for them to manage.
mm,
Like when you're a clinician, like we are, and I'm sure you have had this experience in your years of doing social work and psychotherapy, but we've treated schizophrenics and we've treated people who have rather glaringly different brains, whether they were autistic or any other disordered stuff. And when you're dealing with somebody who's schizophrenic, there can be high levels of delusion and there can be high levels of paranoia. And when you're witnessing that as a clinician, it's it's like a reality thing. You're kind of like, wow, this really is a thing. I learned about it in school, but here we are. I have this client and she's telling me that she's going to be performing at Carnegie Hall today, but she lives in housing and she smells like BO and she has showered and she's got a pearl necklace on and she's very majestic. And it's obvious that she is not connecting with real thoughts. So that experience of understanding that this brain is working different is something that we can kind of put our minds around as clinicians because we're exposed to this. Not everyone is exposed to this kind of thing. And so, especially since the narcissist is really adept at portraying themselves very different than the schizophrenic presents. So, this is somebody who can completely blend into society. These are your neighbors. These are, your priests, your poets, priests, and politicians are kissing babies and stabbing you in the back potentially. But the idea that their brain works differently is very hard to manage. It was hard for me to manage, and I think it's hard for others to manage. And so what happens there is I think they are applying their logical brains or their empathetic brains to this person.
mm.
And that's where the hope and denial sort of show up because I don't know that they're conceptualizing like, okay, this person's brain is in fact working differently than mine. And I don't know if it's scary for us as creatures to understand that, this idea that they're not going to be empathetic, maybe that poses a threat, which it might and does oftentimes. But this concept seems to be very hard. I see a lot of people, particularly ones that are very empathetic, like they will be like, but I don't understand. Doesn't, and they don't really grasp, but no, this person's brain is functioning different.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really fascinating. And I like the way you differentiated that from, a severe mental illness like schizophrenia to, narcissism, which is severe and certainly has some deleterious impact on others and on humanity, but it doesn't necessarily look different. Certainly not at first glance, and certainly not in certain settings where we will find them. So that's really fascinating. There is also many who, I mean, I know, and you probably see this too, who are not at liberty, not in a position where they can easily exit a relationship with a narcissist. And I often say, don't judge people who stay. I mean, I say this when I'm speaking to other audiences of clinicians or to the general public. Don't judge people because they choose to stay. Don't call them crazy or what's wrong with you or why is it taking you so long. There may be financial consequences. There may be children who they don't want to leave in the custody of the narcissist where they can't supervise during those times that they are apart. There can be a number of reasons. They could just be so under the threat right now for their own wellness and survival that it's not so easy to just step out and step away. It may take more time to do so. But there's a lot of shame that comes with that, right? And I'm curious about your thoughts about the role of shame that keeps people bonded to partners. So, in addition to what I was talking about, how do you dismantle when shame is really the culprit in all of this?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I remember being in the relationship and crying on the bathroom floor and knowing that I was going to be, roped back in, just knowing ahead of time. Like I knew. And the shame would actually wash over my body. I would feel like this flush cellularly of like, oh, like I can't believe I'm enduring this again, kind of a thing. And I think what narcissists do in those moments when you can get love bombed back in is that they turn up the dial. So there's this real sort of like, oh, you tolerated that. Let me try this now. And then the stakes get higher and the shame increases. And by the time you kind of think, oh my God, I have to get out of here, you're well into this trauma bonded scenario. And it's very, very difficult to kind of, you know, take that leap. I felt like when I did it, I sort of held my nose and like jumped in the water or something. It was very, very almost like a disembodiment, like I was free falling. And I think a lot of drug addicts probably feel similarly. This idea of like, taking that step to like walk into a rehab or something must feel like, oh my God, I'm actually going to do this thing because you have to give up that thing that is so scary to be without. But I think the shame of it, I think, is something that we all feel and that they monitor. I think they watch to see, okay, you endured that. You endured something that was, shameful, or I shamed you. Let me try this. And if I don't know if that helps listeners to sort of like want to get away from them more. But certainly we honor people staying for a variety of different reasons. It's always best to get away if you can. I always say to people, having done Ironman events and giant like triathlons and races, I would envision the finish line. So, when you do an Ironman race, there's a guy, used to be Mike Riley. I don't think he does it anymore, but Vanessa Reiser, you are an Iron Man. And you cross the finish line and he says your name. And I watch those videos and I cry and I'm going, I can do this. I'm going to train more because I got to get to that finish line. And similarly, it feels like this, I think, for people. It's like the next year, this time is coming with or without you having done this thing. Time is not going to stop for us. Do you want to have this behind you? Or do you want to have it still, lurking, like that finish line of like getting into that apartment, even if it's a tiny little place and your kids are, wearing hand-me-downs and all of the things, and you have to, but there's something beautiful about that rebirth that includes, having a warm bath with nobody to walk around eggshells with, or, doing all the things that you want to do. And so I'm still, in spite of all of that, really advocating for people to have that autonomy again and that freedom if they can.
If they can. Yeah, yeah. And of course there are those that are actually working on it with their partners, and yay when that works, when that
Mhm.
helps. This is an interesting segue because it one of the questions was that you speak so candidly and boldly and openly in sharing your own story. And has that voice evolved over time? What actually helped you to step into it more fully?
I when I got out of that relationship, ended up in the judicial system. So the family court system was really, really hard. Not as hard as some people, because I was not co-parenting with him, and I honor that as being like an absolute nightmare. But I did find myself having to deal with orders of protection and stalking and other things. But in this process, I signed something called civil restraints, which is similar to an NDA, which means like you don't talk about him, he doesn't talk about you. And on its face, it sounds like a really good idea. But it ended up, disempowering me because as somebody who is in this field, I felt like I couldn't really share my story. And in October of last year, the civil restraints were lifted. And now I feel very at peace. It's not that I'm running around saying his name or doing anything really differently at all. But there's something about knowing that I have a voice that is so comforting. And so I really caution people to be careful about things that they sign. Life is long. And narcissistic people are very, very concerned about optics and narrative, and they'll be very, very interested in silencing you and making sure that you don't tell the truth about who they are. So, but I would be very careful about that. I don't think there's, and I shouldn't say that. I know there is no price on my voice. You can't give me $1 zillion for me to be silenced. It was too uncomfortable. It felt like like an elephant was on my chest or somebody's foot was on my throat. And I've talked to Gretchen Carlson about this and the phenomenal work she does with NDAs and, understanding what it's like to have no voice for so many victims, that are suffering in silence. I think in order for things to change, we have to sort of, sound off about this. But I think, doing my run across New York was very empowering. But I think last year in October,
Say a little bit
that's when,
about that for our listeners.
yeah, I ran across the state of New York, 285 miles in a wedding dress to raise awareness for narcissistic abuse. Um, and I think a lot of, yeah, I think a lot of people were suffering in silence. We're like, go, Vanessa, go. Even though it was the craziest, stupidest thing you could really see. It was like this lunatic running across the streets in this long veil. But I did it on purpose so that people would start talking. And it was, I wanted to be sort of the muse of this conversation of like, so I didn't mind being the lunatic doing that. But um, I think last year is when I felt really like like to be free from, that experience. A lot of
I
people,
thought it was very poignant, not so much lunatic, but you know what? It made a big statement. It made a big statement, right?
yeah, and I'm glad that people, you know, saw it, were glad about it. And yeah, so it was also selfish in some ways because it was very transformative for me in my own healing because I was still going through that process. So to see that I could do it, and I had a team and people were supportive, it was sort of this mutually beneficial thing. Everybody was kind of feeling good about it.
Self-focused, self-focused. I like that.
Self-focused.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned shame, and I mentioned shame in this question. And let's also remember that when you talk about the optics, narcissists have big bucket loads full of shame underneath this, larger than life persona. And they too will do whatever they can to protect that persona so that they are not shamed and they are not seen as the bad guy and the bad one. And this can also make it very difficult because of all the threats that will reign large on someone who is, attempting to leave, making it difficult, to get out. Um, your a question that comes up here is what does the real healing look like? Whether you're in the relationship, you're outside the relationship, you have to carve a bubble out for yourself in the meantime, you're not ready to exit, or you have, and now you're looking back and you're looking forward and you're trying to figure out what next. What does real healing look like? Not the Instagram version of that, but the that kind of messy, nonlinear way of healing.
I think a good amount of people, as I mentioned earlier, need to shift their inner dialogues
Mm,
into something that is particularly self-loving. Maybe some people are reparenting themselves.
mm,
For people who were in an intimate relationship, a lot of times they need to go back and find that person they were prior.
mm.
That's what I did. I was like, I have to go find that girl, get on my bike again and kind of listen to the music that connects me to the version of myself that I lost.
Yeah,
But I think if you were in a cultic scenario and you grew up in these environments, it can be very challenging because you have to develop a sense of identity out of nowhere and kind of like just deciding who are you, what are your hobbies, what are you actually interested outside of the cultic family system or a cult. And so I think that's important. I usually do the five senses with people, as I mentioned, like that part of it in terms of daily structured, like kindness, kind of making sure that you are leaning into those behaviors so that you're really being kind. Little things go a long way.
I love that.
Connecting with people who get it, people that are not passive aggressive, people that are kind, that will hold space for you. Um, I think humor and levity can be tremendous in terms of healing. We want to try to get those different neural pathways because there's like, this idea that you're going to be thinking rather rigidly in terms of, and most of us do this anyway. It's not even that you have to have gone through trauma to sort of be on co-pilot all the time. But I think sort of flexing that is important. And I do believe in the empowerment thing. I am spend a lot of time with my clients who are really, really um, givers. And I ask them to turn and look at themselves. You know, what are the things that you are building mastery around? Um, what are the things that you're passionate about? You know, kind of playing with a lot of that feels almost like life coaching, and that's on purpose. But yeah, a lot of that kind of like taking pictures of yourself, putting them up in your home so you can celebrate yourself, this kind of
Oh,
stuff. And people are
oh,
like, what? I'm not gonna do that. Yeah, you are. Yeah, we are. We're gonna, and I just want them to really love themselves. Because as I said, a lot of them are almost averse. Like, what do you mean? Like, oh, that's gross. I'm not gonna do that. That's yeah, no, we're doing that. So we kind of lean into that a little bit, and I think
I
that can
love
be very
this.
helpful.
Love this. I love everything you just said there regarding that healing process. That's brilliant and beautiful. And I know listeners will get so much from that. Grief is such a big part of this too, isn't it? And it can really get in the way, but it's a complicated kind of grief because it's not the straightforward, I've lost someone who loved me so well, but I lost the dream. The wish died. The dream is dead. The everything that I thought was going to be is never going to come to be. And you don't get that closure that you might get in other relationships when they come to an end. So
Yeah.
everything you just said is just so important for, I guess, revitalizing one's sense of self again, coming alive.
Yeah, and I think when people aren't just grieving the relationship, they're grieving like sometimes society at large. They're kind of wondering, like, are there people that are just bad around me? And this kind of
Mm.
like, so they're not just grieving like the white picket fence and the family and the concepts that maybe the future faking provided.
Mhm.
It's that they're grieving um goodness or something. And it can feel very burdensome. I mean, even for myself, some days to think about, writ large, this idea that there are people that are just, not, particularly those that are sociopathic, that are kind of
Yeah.
hazardous and stuff like that. So that can be really hard and weighty. And so you have to look for the silver linings. You have to, and there are so many everywhere. I don't care what your scenario is, there are. And so, but you have to try to find them. And it's definitely, again, a different pathway that we're going to take in our brains sometimes. But yeah, I think you have to find the silver linings.
That's nice. That's such a nice hope swell. I love that. I love that. I want to respect your time, but there's just two more questions if I might. Now maybe I'll blend them together. What is one question that you wish every person listening who's living in a painful relationship would ask themselves more quickly? And if you could just leave people who are listening with one truth, and maybe I know the one thing is often hard, but maybe one of many truths about narcissistic abuse that might change the trajectory of their lives, what would that be?
Okay, so the first one, what was the first one again?
Something they might have come to sooner, something they might have realized or asked themselves sooner.
Oh, I think, you know, the the remedy or the kryptonite or the way to keep people like this away from you or keep them from harming you is to lean into your agency and autonomy and be very true to yourself. So I think you have to develop a very strong chat with yourself. And in this chat, it has to be, what do you want? What do you do? What do you really want? And who are you really? Less of this sort of running it through the lens of approval from either mother, father, the bully in high school, or the narcissistic abuser, or society and the media, and but like, who are you actually? And leaning into that discovery. So you begin like to talk to yourself about who you really are, and try to remove the other voices in your head about who you think you're supposed to be.
Mm, love it. I love that.
And then what was the second one?
The
Sorry.
the trajectory, the something, what is the one thing you'd want as a takeaway? The a truth about narcissistic abuse that changes the trajectory in one's life.
I think understanding that all of the characteristics and behaviors are about control. They're not about sex. They're not about money. They're not about the manipulative stuff. They are about control. And if you are harder to control, then you will be able to live your life and reach your truest potential. And it's not to say that you shouldn't collaborate. It's not to say that you shouldn't acquiesce in certain scenarios. It's not to say you shouldn't forgive with somebody's apologies and changed behaviors, but that you have control over yourself,
Mhm.
right? Like this idea that like you're just going to have boundaries and you're going to manage control over your own life and your own destiny. Um, and reaching self-actualization, as Maslow talks about in the hierarchy of needs, this idea of like, getting out of this the different phases and you have safety, you have self-esteem, you have important relationships, and then you kind of reach the pinnacle of self-actualization. You're only going to get there when you study yourself and you have boundaries and you're kind of autonomous and you focus on your legacy and the things that are important versus like some of these energy grabs. So I love when people are focusing on their journeys less of other people's problems.
Mm, that's beautiful. I love that. What a pleasure. Tell people where they can learn more about you, find out more about the goodies you have to offer. Where can they go?
Sure. So I am on Instagram at Vanessa Reiser, LCSW. My website is telatherapist, TELLA therapist.net. And my book is available on Amazon, Narcissistic Abuse, A Therapist Guide to Identifying, Escaping, and Healing from Toxic and Manipulative People.
Thank you. Been
Thank
such a
you.
pleasure to be with you.
Always.